A black man finds himself in a difficult situation. Officers humiliate him, arrest him, and deny him the right to make a call. But what happens next shocks everyone who witnessed the event. Learn how resilience and courage can change even the most hopeless circumstances. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The warm, amber light of a late afternoon bathed the room, casting soft shadows across the cluttered desk. Piles of letters and documents stood like small mountains, some neatly tied with ribbons, others spilling over in disarray. Each envelope bore a different address, yet they all carried a similar plea. "Help us, Dr. Randolph." Elias Randolph leaned back in his chair, the worn leather creaking softly beneath him. His fingers traced the edge of an opened letter, but his mind was elsewhere. Across the desk sat an invitation, printed on thick cream-colored paper. The bold black lettering at the top read, "Civil Rights Conference, Atlanta Chapter." Elias had lost count of how many such invitations he had received over the years. Normally, he would have accepted without hesitation, but something about this one gave him pause. It wasn't the location, though the Deep South still carried its shadows of danger, but rather a growing doubt within himself. He stood and walked to the window, pushing it open slightly to let the cool breeze in. The sounds of the city filtered through, children laughing, a street vendor calling out his wares, the faint hum of traffic. These were the sounds of life, the life he had fought to protect and uplift. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that his words, his actions, had become a quiet echo in an unyielding world. His secretary, Clara, entered the room with her usual efficiency, a stack of freshly sorted mail in hand. "You've been staring at that letter for hours," she said, setting the mail down. "What's holding you back?" Elias turned, offering a faint smile. "Clara, do you ever feel like the world is moving faster than we can change it?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "Is that a rhetorical question, or are you asking for my professional opinion?" Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Both, perhaps. It's just, there are days I wonder if what we do makes a difference. Words only go so far. People listen, they clap, but do they change?" Clara crossed her arms, her expression softening. "Elias, you've saved lives with your work. You've inspired countless people to stand up for themselves. You might not see the change immediately, but it's happening. Don't let doubt stop you now." He nodded slowly, her words stirring something within him. The doubts lingered, but so did the responsibility. The next morning, Elias stood outside his brownstone, suitcase in hand. A sleek black car pulled up and the driver stepped out to greet him. "Dr. Randolph." "Yes, that's me," Elias replied, shaking the young man's hand. "I'm Mark. I'll be driving you down to Atlanta. Pleasure to meet you, sir." Mark was in his early 20s, with an energy that seemed to radiate from him. As they loaded Elias's suitcase into the trunk, the young man's excitement was evident. "I've read about you," Mark said as they pulled away from the curb. "It's an honor to be working with someone who's actually making history." Elias smiled but said nothing, letting the compliment pass. As they left the city behind, the landscape began to change. Tall buildings gave way to rolling hills and endless stretches of farmland. The car hummed along the highway, and for a while, the two men sat in companionable silence. "So, what's it like?" Mark finally asked. "What's what like?" Elias replied, glancing at the young man. "Being you, making speeches, fighting the good fight, knowing people look up to you." Elias considered the question for a moment. "It's humbling," he said, "but it's also heavy. When people look up to you, they expect you to have all the answers. And the truth is, I don't. I'm just as lost as anyone else, trying to find my way." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "That's honest. I like that." As they drove further south, the atmosphere began to shift. The vibrant greenery seemed muted, the air heavier. Mark pointed out small towns they passed, each with its own history and character. "See that diner?" Mark said, gesturing to a faded building with a peeling sign. "My uncle told me they still have separate entrances for black and white folks. Can you believe that?" Elias said nothing, but his expression grew somber. Further down the road, they stopped at a gas station. While Mark filled the tank, Elias went inside to buy water. The clerk, an older white man with a grizzled beard, barely looked up as Elias approached the counter. "That'll be $1, the man said curtly. Elias handed over the money and waited for his change, but the man simply turned away, pretending to busy himself with something else. "Sir," Elias said calmly, "you owe me 50 cents. The man turned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're lucky I even sold it to you," he muttered, tossing the coins onto the counter. Elias picked up the change without a word and walked out. Back in the car, Mark noticed his silence. "Everything okay?" "Just a reminder," Elias said quietly, "of how much work we still have to do." The road ahead stretched on, winding through forests and past empty fields. The air inside the car grew heavier with unspoken tension as they neared their destination. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "We should probably take the detour," he said, glancing at a map. "The main road goes through a rough area." Elias shook his head. "We'll stick to the direct route." Mark hesitated. "I'm not trying to argue, but are you sure? That's not the safest road for folks like us." Elias's gaze was steady. "Fear is what they want. If we avoid the main road, we're giving them power. We'll be fine." As they continued down the narrow, empty stretch of highway, the tension grew palpable. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. Mark's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, but he said nothing. Elias stared out the window, his thoughts distant yet resolute. In the distance, the faint glow of headlights appeared. A patrol car was parked at the edge of the road, its silhouette stark against the fading light. Mark's voice was barely above a whisper. "I hope you're right, Dr. Randolph." Elias didn't reply. He simply straightened his posture, his expression unreadable as they approached the car. The patrol car's lights flashed once, then again. Mark slowed to a stop, his breath shallow. The next moment would change everything. The patrol car's lights bathed the narrow stretch of road in red and blue, casting fleeting shadows across the trees. The oppressive silence in the car was broken only by the faint hum of the engine. Mark glanced nervously at Elias, who sat upright, his expression calm but resolute. "They're stopping us," Mark muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. His voice trembled, betraying his growing unease. Elias nodded once, his gaze fixed ahead. "Stay calm. Don't argue. Let me do the talking." Mark swallowed hard as he eased the car to the side of the road. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness of the evening. The patrol car pulled up behind them, its headlights glaring through the rear window. Two officers stepped out. One was tall and lean, his uniform immaculate, his face set in a cold, stern expression. The other was stockier, his movements brusque, his hat tilted slightly askew. The tall officer approached on Mark's side, while his partner circled the car to Elias's window. "Evening," the tall officer drawled, leaning down to peer at Mark through the open window. "License and registration." Mark fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking slightly as he handed over his license. Elias reached into the glove compartment and retrieved the registration papers, passing them to Mark, who handed them to the officer. "Whose car is this?" the officer asked, narrowing his eyes. "It's mine," Elias replied, his voice steady. The second officer, standing at Elias's window, let out a low chuckle. "Yours, huh? A fancy car like this? Doesn't seem to add up." Elias met the man's gaze without flinching. "The paperwork is in order. You can verify it." The tall officer scanned the documents, his frown deepening. He glanced at Elias, then at Mark. "What brings you boys out here?" "We're traveling to Atlanta," Elias replied. "For what?" "A civil rights conference," Elias said evenly. The stocky officer snorted, his hand resting on the butt of his baton. "Civil rights, huh? You one of those troublemakers stirring up good folks?" Elias didn't react to the jab. "I'm a professor, and I'm traveling to deliver a lecture." The tall officer handed the documents back to Mark but didn't move away. His eyes lingered on Elias, calculating. "You got ID?" he asked. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his wallet, handing over his driver's license. The officer scrutinized it, his lip curling slightly as he read the name and address. "Well, Professor Randolph," the officer said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "you sure you're not out here causing trouble? A man like you driving a car like this, in a place like this, doesn't sit right with me." Mark clenched his fists on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "Sir, we're just passing through," he said, his voice tight. The stocky officer leaned closer to the window. "Watch your tone, boy. You're not in a position to talk back." Elias placed a hand on Mark's arm, a silent gesture to calm him. "We're cooperating fully, officers. There's no need for hostility." The tall officer smirked. "Cooperating, huh? Well, let's see just how cooperative you are. Step out of the vehicle, both of you." Mark froze, his breath hitching. Elias nodded and opened his door, stepping out with deliberate calm. Mark followed, his movements stiff and hesitant. The officers guided them to the back of the car. The stocky one began patting down Elias while the tall one searched Mark. "This car's way too nice for someone like you," the stocky officer muttered as he patted Elias's pockets. "Bet you stole it." "I purchased it legally," Elias replied. "You can check the registration." The officer ignored him, moving on to his briefcase. He opened it and rifled through the papers inside, scattering them carelessly onto the ground. "Hey," Mark protested, "you can't just—" "Quiet," the tall officer barked, shoving Mark against the car. Elias's voice was firm but calm. "There's no need for this. We've done nothing wrong." The stocky officer straightened, his face darkening. "You don't tell us what we need to do." For a long moment, the air was thick with tension. Then the tall officer spoke. "All right. I think we've seen enough. Put your hands behind your back." Mark's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "Suspicion of stolen property," the officer replied curtly. "This is ridiculous," Elias said, his tone still measured. "Ridiculous or not, you're under arrest," the stocky officer said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. As the cold metal clamped around his wrists, Elias's mind raced. He knew arguing would only make things worse. He met Mark's panicked gaze and gave a small, reassuring nod. "We'll handle this," he said quietly. The officers led them to the patrol car and pushed them into the back seat. Elias stared out the window as the car began to move, the scenery passing by in a blur. He felt a storm brewing within him, a mix of anger and frustration, but he forced himself to remain composed. Mark sat beside him, his breathing shallow. "What are we going to do, Dr. Randolph?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes, drawing on every ounce of strength he had. "We're going to stay calm," he said finally, "and we're going to demand our rights." The patrol car pulled into a small police station, a squat brick building with dimly lit windows. The officers escorted them inside, where a grizzled desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork. "Got a couple of troublemakers," the tall officer said, tossing their documents onto the counter. The sergeant glanced at Elias and Mark, his expression unreadable. "Put them in holding. We'll deal with them later." The officers led them down a narrow hallway lined with cells. They shoved Mark into one and Elias into another, locking the heavy iron doors behind them. The stocky officer leaned close to the bars, a sneer on his face. "Welcome to the South, Professor. Hope you enjoy your stay." As their footsteps receded, Elias sat down on the cold, hard bench. His wrists throbbed from the cuffs and his shoulders ached, but his mind was sharp, calculating. Across the hall, Mark gripped the bars of his cell, his face pale. "This ain't right," he said, his voice shaking. "They can't do this." "They can," Elias said quietly. "And they just did. But we're not going to let them get away with it." Mark sank onto the bench in his cell, burying his head in his hands. "What if they don't let us out? What if they—" "They won't break us," Elias interrupted, his voice firm. "Stay strong, Mark. We've faced worse before." The sound of the station door opening echoed through the halls, followed by the clatter of boots on the tiled floor. Elias straightened, his resolve hardening. Whatever came next, he would face it head on. The air inside the cell was suffocating, a mix of mildew, sweat, and despair. Elias sat on the cold metal bench, his hands resting on his knees, his posture as calm as he could manage. He watched Mark across the hall, pacing like a caged animal. The young man's energy, which earlier had seemed boundless, now boiled into frustration and fear. "How long do you think they'll keep us here?" Mark finally asked, gripping the bars of his cell. His voice cracked, revealing the fear he tried to mask. Elias folded his hands together, leaning forward slightly. "As long as they want to intimidate us. But intimidation only works if we let it." Mark snorted, his pacing quickening. "Easy for you to say. You've been through this before, haven't you? People respect you. Me? I'm just some kid they'll throw away without thinking twice." Elias stood, crossing the narrow cell. He grasped the bars and looked directly at Mark. "Don't you ever think that way. They want you to believe you're powerless, but you're not. We're not." Mark looked at him, his breathing heavy, but before he could reply, the sound of boots on the tiled floor interrupted them. The tall officer, the one Elias had already come to associate with cruelty disguised as professionalism, appeared at the end of the hallway. Behind him was his stocky partner, whose sneer seemed to have become a permanent fixture. "Rise and shine, boys," the tall officer said, his tone mockingly cheerful. "Time for a little chat." Elias stepped back from the bars, standing tall. Mark hesitated but followed suit, his posture less certain. The officers unlocked Elias's cell first, leading him out with an unnecessary grip on his arm. As they reached Mark's cell, the stocky officer jabbed a finger at him. "You stay put. We'll deal with you later." Mark's eyes widened, but Elias gave him a small nod, silently urging him to stay calm. The officers guided Elias down the narrow hallway, the dim light flickering overhead. They passed other cells, some empty, others occupied by figures who barely stirred as they walked by. The weight of the station's oppressive atmosphere pressed down on Elias, but he refused to let it show. They brought him into a small, windowless room with a single metal table and 2 chairs. The tall officer gestured for him to sit, while the stocky one leaned against the door, arms crossed. The tall officer placed a file on the table and sat across from Elias, opening it with deliberate slowness. "Professor Randolph," he began, drawing out the title like a joke, "you found yourself in quite the predicament." Elias met his gaze steadily. "I'd say it's less of a predicament and more of an injustice." The officer smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You've got a sharp tongue, but let's cut the theatrics. We've got a problem here." Elias raised an eyebrow. "The only problem I see is your abuse of authority." The stocky officer pushed off the door and took a step forward, his face twisting in anger. "Watch it, Professor. You don't get to talk to us like that." The tall officer held up a hand, stopping his partner. Now, let's not lose our cool. The professor here thinks he's got the upper hand. Let's remind him where he is." He leaned forward, tapping the file in front of him. "This car you're driving? It's too nice for someone like you. A man like you shouldn't be able to afford it." Elias's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "The car is mine. The registration proves it." The officer waved dismissively. "Paperwork can be forged, and even if it's legitimate, it doesn't explain why you're driving through this part of the state. A man like you must be up to something." Elias clasped his hands together on the table. "A man like me," he said slowly, "is simply traveling to a conference to speak about justice and equality, something you seem determined to prevent." The stocky officer slammed his hand on the table. "You don't get to talk down to us. You think you're better than us." Elias didn't flinch. He held the stocky officer's gaze, unyielding. "I think you're afraid of what someone like me represents. Change." The tall officer's smirk faltered for a moment before returning. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't get you out of here. We're not interested in your speeches, Professor. We're interested in why you think you can waltz through our town like you own the place." Elias leaned forward slightly. "Because I refuse to be afraid. And you hate that, don't you? You hate that I won't cower before your authority." The stocky officer took another step forward, but the tall one stopped him again. "Enough," he said sharply. He turned back to Elias. "Here's the deal. You admit you stole that car and we'll let you off with a slap on the wrist. Keep lying, and things are going to get a lot worse for you." Elias stared at him, his expression calm but resolute. "I won't admit to something I didn't do." The tall officer's smirk disappeared entirely. He closed the file and stood, looming over Elias. "Then you'd better get comfortable, Professor. You're not going anywhere." The officers escorted Elias back to his cell, their grip on his arms tighter than before. They shoved him inside without a word, slamming the door shut behind him. Mark rushed to the bars, his eyes filled with worry. What happened? What did they say? Elias sat down on the bench, his expression thoughtful. "They want me to admit to stealing the car. I refused." Mark cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "They're not going to let us go, are they?" Elias looked up at him, his gaze steady. "They're trying to break us, but they won't succeed." The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The officers passed by occasionally, throwing taunts and insults, but Elias remained composed. Mark, however, grew increasingly agitated, his pacing turning into restless energy. At one point, another man was brought into the cell block. He was older, his face lined with years of hardship. He was placed in the cell next to Mark's and sat down heavily on the bench. "What are you in for?" Mark asked cautiously. The man chuckled bitterly. Wrong place, wrong time. Same as you, I reckon. They began to talk in hushed tones, their conversation revealing the man's experiences with the local police and the systemic injustice that plagued the area. His words painted a grim picture, but they also sparked something in Mark, a growing understanding of the fight Elias had dedicated his life to. As night fell, the station grew quieter, but the tension remained. Elias closed his eyes, leaning back against the wall. He thought of his father, a man who had faced his own share of injustices, but had always held his head high. He thought of the people who looked to him for strength and inspiration, and he resolved to remain unshaken. In the darkness, his voice broke the silence. Mark, remember this. They can take our freedom, but they can't take our dignity. That's ours to protect. Mark nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling over him. The night was long, but Elias's resolve never wavered. He knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew he wouldn't face it alone. The dim light of dawn seeped through the small, grimy windows near the ceiling of the holding cells. It cast pale beams across the floor, illuminating the cold, unyielding reality of their imprisonment. Elias sat on the hard bench in his cell, his hands resting on his lap. The weariness from a sleepless night pressed heavily on his shoulders, but his resolve remained unbroken. Across the hallway, Mark lay curled on his bench, his breathing shallow, his face etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor, breaking the oppressive silence. Mark stirred, sitting up abruptly as the two officers, Randy and Joe, approached. Randy's expression was as smug as ever, while Joe looked as though the weight of the night had settled heavily on his conscience. "Rise and shine," Randy barked, his voice sharp and mocking. "The professor here looks like he's had a long night. Maybe today he'll come to his senses." Mark moved to the bars of his cell, gripping them tightly. "You can't keep us here. We haven't done anything wrong." Joe shot Mark a glance, but it was Randy who responded. "You're lucky we haven't charged you with resisting arrest, boy. Sit tight. You'll get your turn." Elias stood slowly, his expression calm but firm. "What exactly is your plan, Officer Randy? Keep us here indefinitely? Deny us our rights until we give you what you want?" Randy smirked, unlocking Elias's cell. "You're not in any position to be asking questions, Professor. Let's go. We're going to have another little chat." As they escorted Elias down the corridor, Joe lingered behind for a moment, his gaze meeting Mark's. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the injustice unfolding. But before Mark could say anything, Joe turned and followed Randy. They led Elias into the same interrogation room as before, the air inside stale and oppressive. The same metal table awaited him, and Randy gestured for him to sit. Joe stood by the door, his posture tense, his eyes avoiding Elias's. Randy dropped a file onto the table and leaned forward, his hands planted firmly on the metal surface. "Here's the deal, Professor. We're getting real tired of your games. You think you're better than us? Think your fancy words and education mean anything here?" Elias met Randy's gaze evenly. "What I think," he said slowly, "is that you're trying to break me because you can't stand the idea of someone like me standing up to someone like you." Randy's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "You've got a lot of nerve, but nerve won't get you out of here." Elias tilted his head slightly. "Neither will intimidation. So why don't we skip the theatrics and get to the point?" Randy straightened, crossing his arms. "Fine. You want your phone call? You've got it. Let's see who's really on your side." Joe shifted uncomfortably by the door, But he said nothing as Randy handed Elias the phone. The officer's smirk widened. "Go ahead. Call whoever you want. Let's see if they can help you." Elias took the phone, his fingers steady as he dialed. The line rang once, twice, before a calm, authoritative voice answered on the other end. "This is the White House operator. How may I direct your call?" Randy's smirk faltered slightly, and Joe's eyes widened. Elias's voice was steady as he spoke. "This is Dr. Elias Randolph. I need to speak with President Kennedy. It's urgent." The operator hesitated for only a moment. "One moment, Dr. Randolph. Please hold." The room fell into a tense silence as the call was transferred. Randy's smirk had all but disappeared, replaced by a look of disbelief. Joe's hand tightened on the doorframe, his expression unreadable. When the line connected again, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "This is President Kennedy." Elias spoke calmly, clearly. "Mr. President, I apologize for the intrusion, but I find myself in a precarious situation. I've been wrongfully detained by local law enforcement while traveling to Atlanta for a civil rights conference. The charges are baseless, and I fear this is yet another attempt to intimidate those of us working for justice and equality." Kennedy's tone was firm, his words measured. "Dr. Randolph, I assure you, this will be addressed immediately. Where are you being held?" Elias provided the information, his words crisp and deliberate. He didn't glance at the officers, but he could feel the tension radiating from them. When the call ended, Elias set the phone down and folded his hands on the table. "Well," he said quietly, "I believe help is on the way." Randy's face was a mask of barely contained fury. "You think you can just call the president and get away with this? Who the hell do you think you are?" Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "A citizen who knows his rights, and a man who refuses to be silenced." Joe cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "Randy, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Joe," Randy snapped, slamming his hands on the table. "This isn't over." But it was clear, even to Randy, that the balance of power had shifted. He stormed out of the room, leaving Joe to escort Elias back to his cell. As they walked down the corridor, Joe's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "I didn't sign up for this," he said, not meeting Elias's gaze. Elias glanced at him, his expression softening slightly. "Then perhaps it's time to decide what you stand for." When they reached the cell, Mark was waiting anxiously, his hands gripping the bars. "What happened? What did you do?" Elias stepped inside, the door clanging shut behind him. "I made a call," he said simply. "Now we wait." Hours passed, the tension in the station growing thicker with each passing minute. Randy paced the hallway, barking orders at anyone who crossed his path, while Joe kept to the shadows, his expression troubled. Finally, the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside shattered the uneasy quiet. Moments later, the door to the station burst open, and a group of federal agents entered, their presence commanding and unmistakable. The lead agent, a tall man in a crisp suit, approached the desk sergeant with a no-nonsense expression. "We're here for Dr. Elias Randolph. Release him immediately." The sergeant stammered, his face pale. I'll need to speak to the officers in charge." The agent cut him off. "No, you won't. This is a federal matter now. Get him out here." Randy appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger. "You can't just barge in here." "We can," the agent said coldly, "and we will, unless you want to explain to the president himself why you've unlawfully detained an innocent man." The next moments were a blur of activity. Elias and Mark were released from their cells, their personal belongings returned to them hastily. Randy glared at Elias, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, Mark let out a shaky laugh, his relief palpable. "I can't believe it. We're free." Elias nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "For now. But this isn't the end. Not for us, and not for them." The federal agents escorted them to a waiting car, the promise of safety and justice lingering in the air. But as Elias looked back at the station, he knew the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning. The evening air felt heavy, laden with the weight of the day's events. Elias sat in the back of the black sedan provided by the federal agents, the soft hum of the engine a sharp contrast to the chaos he had left behind. Mark was seated beside him, his shoulders slumped, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Despite their release, a quiet tension hung in the air, an unspoken understanding that the events of the day were far from over. The lead agent, a no-nonsense man named Peterson, turned in his seat to address Elias. "Dr. Randolph, I want to assure you that what happened today will not go unaddressed. The President himself has taken a personal interest in this matter." Elias nodded, his expression composed but thoughtful. "I appreciate the intervention, Agent Peterson, but this isn't just about me. What happened in that station is a symptom of a much larger problem. If we don't address the root, the cycle will continue." Peterson's face tightened, a flicker of unease crossing his features. "I understand your frustration, sir, but these things take time." Elias's gaze shifted to the window, the darkened landscape rolling by. "Time," he said softly, "is something too many people no longer have." Mark shifted beside him, his voice breaking the silence. "What happens to them now? Those officers, I mean. Are they just going to get a slap on the wrist?" Peterson hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "An investigation will be launched. Beyond that, I can't say." Elias's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't push further. He knew the system all too well, the slow grind of bureaucracy, the resistance to change. It wasn't enough to expose injustice. The real battle was ensuring accountability. The car eventually pulled up to a modest motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. Peterson stepped out first, motioning for them to follow. "We've arranged for a safe place for you to stay tonight. We'll have agents stationed nearby in case there are any issues." Elias and Mark stepped out, their legs stiff from the long ride. The motel was unremarkable, its neon sign flickering faintly in the night. Despite its modesty, the sight of it offered a small measure of relief, a chance to rest, if only briefly. Inside their room, Mark collapsed onto one of the twin beds, letting out a long, weary sigh. "I can't believe we made it out of there. I thought for sure we were done for." Elias sat on the edge of the other bed, his hands clasped tightly together. "We were fortunate, but fortune isn't a solution." Mark propped himself up on one elbow, frowning. "You mean those guys back at the station? They'll just keep doing this to people, won't they?" Elias's gaze was distant, his thoughts turning to the countless stories he had heard over the years, of lives ruined, families torn apart by the same kind of systemic abuse they had just faced. "Unless we stop them, yes." Mark sat up fully now, his expression hardening. "Then let's stop them. Let's make sure they can't do this to anyone else." Elias turned to look at him, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "It's not that simple, Mark. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes strategy, persistence, and above all, it takes people willing to stand together." Mark nodded slowly, his youthful determination undimmed. Then we start with us. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Elias rose cautiously, peering through the peephole before opening it. Agent Peterson stood there, his expression grim. "Dr. Randolph, there's something you need to see." Elias followed him outside, where a federal car was parked with its radio on. The agent inside gestured for them to listen. Local authorities have denied any wrongdoing in the detention of civil rights activist Dr. Elias Randolph. Sheriff's Office representatives claim the arrest was carried out in accordance with procedure and have accused Dr. Randolph of attempting to incite unrest. Mark, who had followed them outside, let out a string of curses. "They're trying to make you the bad guy." Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "This isn't unexpected. They're protecting their own." Peterson looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "We're preparing an official response, but this kind of thing can be difficult to navigate." Elias turned to him, his gaze sharp. "Difficult? They're lying to cover up their abuse of power, and you're worried about navigating? This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been silenced, every family that's been torn apart by this kind of corruption." Peterson raised his hands defensively. "I understand, Dr. Randolph, but these things have to be handled carefully. We can't risk escalating the situation." Elias's voice was low, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "Escalation is inevitable when injustice is ignored. The longer we wait, the more people will suffer." The rest of the night passed fitfully, tension hanging heavy in the air. Mark eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, but Elias remained awake, his mind racing. He replayed the events of the day, searching for a way to turn their ordeal into a catalyst for change. By morning, he had a plan. When they arrived in Atlanta for the conference, the atmosphere was electric. News of Elias's detention had spread, drawing media attention and amplifying the significance of his speech. As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He began slowly, his voice calm but powerful. "Yesterday, I was reminded of the reality many of us face every day, a reality where dignity is stripped away and justice is denied. But I was also reminded of something greater, the power of solidarity, the strength we find in standing together against oppression." He recounted the events of their journey, sparing no detail. The audience listened intently, their anger and determination palpable. "This is not just my story," Elias continued. "It is the story of countless others who have suffered in silence, and it is our responsibility to ensure that silence is broken." The room erupted into applause, a wave of energy that seemed to shake the very walls. After the speech, Elias and Mark were approached by reporters, activists, and community leaders, all eager to support their cause. Among them was a local lawyer who offered to help bring legal action against the officers and the station that had detained them. Elias accepted, knowing that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But as he looked around at the faces of those who stood with him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. That night, as he sat alone in his hotel room, Elias allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought of his father, of the lessons he had taught him about dignity and perseverance. He thought of the countless lives that had been touched by injustice, and the countless more that could be changed through their efforts. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope. The hotel lobby was bustling with activity the morning after Elias's speech. The news of his ordeal had spread like wildfire, drawing journalists, activists, and supporters from across the region. Elias sat in a corner with Mark, watching the commotion unfold around them. The energy was palpable, a mix of outrage and determination, and it filled the air with a sense of purpose. Mark leaned back in his chair, his face a blend of amazement and exhaustion. "You know, Dr. Randolph, I've never seen anything like this. People are fired up. They're ready to do something." Elias nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on a group of young activists discussing plans for a march. "That's the power of truth, Mark. When people see injustice laid bare, it ignites a fire within them. The challenge is to turn that fire into action." Mark smiled wryly. "Well, you sure know how to light a fire." Before Elias could respond, a man approached their table. He was tall and wiry, with sharp features and a piercing gaze. He extended a hand, his voice firm. "Dr. Randolph, I'm James Carter with the Southern Justice Initiative. I'd like to speak with you if you have a moment." Elias shook his hand, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course, Mr. Carter. What can I do for you?" Carter took a seat, his expression serious. "First, I want to commend you for what you've done. Your courage has inspired a movement, but we both know inspiration isn't enough. We need action, and we need it now." Elias's brow furrowed slightly. "What do you have in mind?" Carter leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "We're organizing a campaign to push for federal oversight of local law enforcement, particularly in areas with a history of racial discrimination. Your story has given us the momentum we need to make this a national issue, but we need your help to keep that momentum going." Elias listened carefully, his mind already racing. He had spent years fighting for change, but this was an opportunity to strike at the heart of the system that perpetuated injustice. "I'll do whatever I can," he said finally. "But we need to be strategic. This can't just be about me. It has to be about the countless others who face the same injustice." Carter nodded, a hint of a smile breaking through his stern demeanor. "That's exactly what we're aiming for. We're holding a rally tomorrow to kick off the campaign. Your presence and your voice would mean everything." Elias agreed, and Carter excused himself to continue his preparations. As he walked away, Mark turned to Elias, his eyes wide. "You're really doing this, aren't you? Taking on the whole system?" Elias smiled faintly. "I'm not taking it on alone, Mark. None of us are. That's the only way we'll win. Together." The next day dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that seemed almost at odds with the heavy burden of the work ahead. The rally was held in a sprawling park on the outskirts of the city, the open space quickly filling with a diverse crowd. Signs and banners waved in the breeze, their messages bold and unyielding. Justice now. End police brutality. Equality for all. Elias stood behind the stage, watching as the crowd continued to grow. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the hope and determination that radiated from them. It was a weight he carried willingly, knowing that his voice could amplify theirs. Mark joined him, holding a small notebook. "I jotted down some things you might want to include in your speech," he said, handing it over. Elias glanced through the notes, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've got a knack for this, Mark. Maybe you should be the one up there." Mark laughed, shaking his head. "I'll leave that to you, Doc, but seriously, you're gonna kill it." When it was time, Elias stepped onto the stage, the crowd's cheers washing over him like a tidal wave. He raised a hand, and the noise subsided, replaced by an expectant hush. He began slowly, his voice calm but powerful. "My friends, today we stand together not just to demand justice, but to affirm our humanity. Yesterday, I was reminded of the depths of injustice that persist in our world. But I was also reminded of something greater, the power of unity, of resilience, of hope. He recounted his experience at the hands of the police, his words vivid and unflinching. The crowd listened intently, their expressions a mix of anger and determination. But this is not just my story, Elias continued. It is the story of every man, woman, and child who has been silenced, oppressed, or denied their dignity. And it is our responsibility, no, our duty, to ensure that their voices are heard. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy palpable. Elias waited for the noise to subside before delivering his final words. Change will not come easily, it will not come quickly, but it will come. Because we will not stop, we will not be silenced, we will not rest until justice is not just a word, but a reality for all. As he stepped off the stage, the crowd surged forward, their cheers echoing across the park. Reporters clamored for interviews, activists sought his advice, and ordinary citizens simply wanted to shake his hand. Among them was Joe, the younger officer from the station. He approached cautiously, his expression conflicted. "Dr. Randolph," he began, his voice hesitant, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened, for my part in it." Elias studied him for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging your part is the first step, Officer Joe. The next step is deciding what you'll do about it." Joe nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I've already started. I'm leaving the force. And I'm joining a group that's working on police reform. It's the least I can do." Elias extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Joe shook it. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of possibility. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Elias sat alone in his hotel room, reflecting on the day. The fight ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming, and he was ready to meet it. The sound of soft footsteps echoed through the nearly empty conference room. Elias sat alone at a long table, his pen moving steadily across the pages of a notebook. The rally from the previous day still lingered in his mind. The roar of the crowd, the determined faces, the unspoken promise of change. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the reality of what lay ahead loomed large. He had no illusions about the challenges they faced. Change, as he had told Mark, would not come quickly or easily, but it would come. It had to. A knock at the door broke his concentration. He looked up to see Mark standing there, a stack of papers in his hands and a familiar, eager energy in his posture. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Mark said, stepping inside. Elias set down his pen and gestured for him to sit. "Not at all. What's on your mind?" Mark dropped the papers onto the table, spreading them out like a deck of cards. "Plans," he said simply. "Ideas for how we keep this momentum going. Carter's group is pushing for more rallies, but I think we need to go deeper. Policy changes, legal challenges, grassroots organizing, things that make this movement last." Elias smiled faintly, his respect for the younger man growing by the day. "You've been busy." Mark shrugged, but there was pride in his voice. "I figure if we're going to do this, we've got to do it right. Yesterday was amazing, but it's just the beginning." Elias picked up one of the papers, scanning the handwritten notes. Mark's ideas were ambitious but thoughtful, ranging from community education programs to partnerships with local churches and businesses. "This is good work," Elias said, setting the paper down. "You're thinking about sustainability, about building something that lasts. That's exactly what we need." Mark beamed, but his expression quickly turned serious. "There's one thing, though. I've been thinking about what you said. to that officer, Joe, about deciding what you stand for, and I realized I don't just want to be the guy holding the signs or passing out flyers. I want to do more." Elias leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. "What kind of more are you thinking?" Mark hesitated, but only for a moment. "I want to learn about organizing, about the law, about how to actually make change happen. I want to be like you." Elias's expression softened, a rare smile breaking through his usual calm demeanor. "Mark, the world doesn't need another me. It needs you, with your own voice, your own perspective. But if you're serious about this, I'll help you any way I can." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Carter, who entered the room with his usual brisk energy. He carried a newspaper under his arm, the bold headline immediately catching Elias's eye. "Civil rights leader demands justice in Deep South." Carter slapped the paper onto the table, grinning. "Your front page news, Dr. Randolph, and not just here. Papers across the country are picking this up. Your story is lighting a fire." Elias picked up the newspaper, his gaze lingering on the photo beneath the headline. It showed him at the rally, his fist raised in defiance, the crowd a sea of determination behind him. "This isn't just my story," Elias said, setting the paper down. "It's the story of every person who's faced injustice. We have to make sure their voices are heard." Carter nodded, his expression turning serious. "That's why I'm here. We need to talk about next steps. The momentum is building, but if we don't channel it effectively, it'll fizzle out. The powers that be are already working to discredit us." Mark frowned. "You mean those statements from the sheriff's office? Saying Dr. Randolph was trying to incite unrest?" "Exactly," Carter said. "They're trying to paint us as agitators, troublemakers. We need to control the narrative, and that means being strategic about our actions." The three men spent the next several hours deep in discussion, mapping out a plan to sustain the movement. They talked about organizing more rallies, filing lawsuits against corrupt law enforcement, and working with sympathetic politicians to push for federal oversight. As the meeting wound down, Elias felt a sense of purpose settle over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they were truly moving forward. That evening, Elias returned to his hotel room, exhausted but energized. He sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky. His thoughts drifted to Joe, the young officer who had apologized at the rally. The memory of their brief conversation lingered, a reminder that even those complicit in injustice could choose a different path. It was a small glimmer of hope, but one that felt significant. Elias reached for his notebook and began to write, his pen moving steadily across the page. He wrote about the rally, about the plans they had discussed, and about the people who had inspired him: Mark, Carter, and even Joe. As he wrote, he thought about his father, a man who had faced his own share of injustices but had always held his head high. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Dignity is not about how others see you. It's about how you see yourself." The next morning, Elias received an unexpected visitor. Joe stood in the lobby, looking nervous but determined. "I'm sorry to bother you," Joe said as Elias approached, "but I needed to talk to you. I've been thinking about what you said, about deciding what I stand for." Elias gestured for him to sit, his expression encouraging. "What's on your mind?" Joe hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I left the force. I couldn't keep being part of something I didn't believe in, but I don't want to just walk away. I want to help fix it." Elias listened carefully, nodding. "That's a difficult choice, Joe. But it's the right one. Real change starts with people willing to take a stand. Joe's voice grew steadier as he spoke. I've already started reaching out to groups working on police reform. I want to be part of the solution. Elias extended a hand and Joe shook it firmly. You've taken the first step, Joe. Now comes the hard part, but you're not alone in this. As Joe left, Elias felt a renewed sense of hope. Change was coming, not just in the halls of power, but in the hearts and minds of people willing to stand up for what was right. That evening, as Elias prepared for another rally, he looked out over the city, the lights twinkling like stars. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt like they were truly moving forward. And he knew, deep in his heart, that they would not stop until justice was not just a dream, but a reality for all. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe so you don't miss new stories. We have many more that will make you think. Share this video with those who appreciate a good story, and check out the channel for more stories like this.